thank you. I just add in one thing there. I don't work for the Financial Times. I work for Bloomberg, just before Bloomberg send in any complaints. Anyway, welcome back from lunch, and thank you for coming back from lunch. I know that it is networking heaven out there, so thank you for coming back and sitting down. Okay. Right. This morning you heard a lot about the problems in our fractured social fabric, and I think it was a fascinating morning. This afternoon we're going to try and bring you a little positive news. We turn to our free markets and good governance stream. I think most of us here today would agree that free enterprise capitalism is the most powerful system we have for human progress and for wealth creation. At the same time, I think we would all agree that the limited liability company is the most important invention of all time. It is the thing that allows us to spread risk and the things that allows us to take all the other risks that allow us to reduce poverty and to create wealth. One of the most important innovations we have ever known. But while we in this room may think that, and I certainly think that, not everyone else does. Something along the way has gone wrong. And here, right now, in 1 hour, we are going to discuss what that is, and we are going to figure out how to fix it. So first, to start off this hour that is going to change the business and corporate world, we have Paul Marshall, one of the founders of ARC and the chairman of Marshall Wace. So, Paul, over to you.
Good afternoon. My subject is free markets and good governance. Now, I am a hedge fund manager, and some might say that hedge fund managers are to good governance what highwaymen are to road safety. But hedge fund managers are also specialists at speaking uncomfortable truths, and that is part of what we are here to do at ARC, so bear with me. We want to do 3 things in the business stream over the next 3 days. First, rejoice in the abundance that true free enterprise and free markets create. Second, acknowledge how free markets can be captured and how they tend towards corporatism and cronyism unless they are firmly checked. And third, to explore what good governance might really look like and how free markets and human innovation can be combined with good governance to ensure human flourishing. The theme of abundance will run all the way through this conference. Human development resembles a hockey stick. For 2 millennia before the year 1800, standards of living more or less flatlined. More than 90% of the planet lived in what is today classified as extreme poverty. Then something happened. That something was the way scientific innovation and free markets came together to create the Industrial Revolution. GDP per capita started rising, first in Holland and Great Britain, then in the rest of Western Europe. It rose as much in 50 years as it had risen in the previous 1800 years. That magic formula was then shared across the world. In the last 75 years, extreme poverty across the world has fallen from 90% to 10%. It has halved in the past 20 years alone. Free market capitalism is the greatest instrument of poverty relief that the world has ever seen. Free markets and scientific innovation can and will also solve the major problems facing humanity today, not least dealing with the challenges associated with climate change. The primary role that free markets play in generating prosperity is a given, axiomatic for almost everyone here today. but it is not recognized by those who are at the wrong end of disruptive innovation. It is not recognized by many of the younger generation who do not see the benefits trickle down to them in the way they did to us boomers. And it is not recognized by the people left behind in flyover country who have seen their factories shuttered and their communities uprooted. For these people, free market capitalism faces a crisis of legitimacy. So we need to stand up for free market capitalism, but we also need to be careful what exactly it is that we are defending. Ultimately, free markets only truly prosper in societies where there is a proper shared understanding of virtue and mutual honor. That is why the City of London prospered for so many years on little more than the ethic of my word is my bond. Corrupt societies, on the other hand, practice tribalism and cronyism. Think Somalia, or Sicily, or Davos. The biggest danger to free markets today is that we are losing that shared understanding of virtue. When virtue breaks down, you begin to see the emergence of mutant strains of capitalism. So let's talk about free market capitalism's mutant siblings. There are three big ones. First, monopoly capitalism. If you play the game of Monopoly long enough, somebody always ends up controlling the board, just like real life. Some in Silicon Valley argue that these winners have earned the right to enjoy the fruits of their success and the right to price gouge to their heart's content. If Apple wants to charge a 30% tax on their app, some might say, let them. They have earned the privilege. The problem with this argument is that the genius behind Apple was Steve Jobs, not the corporate executives who are now clipping the coupons. Predatory behavior is rife in the US, whether it is the Apple App Store or the way Uber treats their drivers or airlines treat their passengers. In most US airports, one airline controls over half the landing rights. Many states have health insurance markets where the top two insurers have an 80 or 90% market share. Perhaps most serious of all, two companies, Google and Meta, control not only half the US digital advertising market, but half the global market. Given the concerns that many of us have about the curtailment of free speech, this is an issue which goes well beyond monopoly capitalism. So I say gently to my US friends that maybe your monopoly laws need to be looked at with a fresh pair of eyes. Maybe the new Speaker of the House will be able to help. The second mutant sibling is crony capitalism. Joseph Schumpeter, the great economist of entrepreneurship, predicted that free market capitalism would end in a form of corporatism not so different from socialism itself. Corporatism is not free enterprise. It is a sort of nightmare endgame for free enterprise, where the managerial and administrative classes take control and manage the system in their own best interests. Let me tell you a story. We are just a few minutes away from Deptford Docks, where the East India Company was launched in 1599. It was one of the first ever joint stock companies, enabling entrepreneurs to connect with providers of capital in an enterprise of pooled risk. The joint stock company was the original cornerstone of free market capitalism. But within a generation, that original spirit was corrupted. Loot became one of the first Indian words to enter the English language. It was an accurate description of what the East India Company were up to in Bengal. By 1756, they had an army of 20,000 soldiers and had embarked on what has been called the supreme act of corporate violence in world history. Eventually, their power was challenged by Parliament through the impeachment of Warren Hastings. But the impeachment failed, because at that stage, nearly a quarter of MPs held stock in the company. What ought to worry us today in the 21st century is that too many successful companies follow the trajectory of the East India Company. Today, neither Google nor Goldman Sachs nor Pfizer employs a standing army of 20,000 soldiers, at least as far as I know. On the other hand, some 2/3 of Congress receives funding from the pharmaceutical industry. Half of them receive funding from the gun lobby. We live in an age of cronyism. We even have an exclusive venue, an annual conference in the Swiss mountains, where the cronies gather once a year to collude in the most efficient way possible. Over €1 billion per annum lobbying in Brussels. This spending has a high return on investment, a high RLI, as you might call it, return on lobbying investment. Take Big Pharma. Big Pharma spends $356 million per annum lobbying in the US. Pfizer alone spends $11 million. In 2021, Pfizer made $35 billion of incremental sales and at least $10 billion of incremental profits from the COVID vaccine. They were granted fast-track authorization and immunity from all liabilities, just in case there were side effects. That is what I call lobbying money well spent. Or take banking. 2008 still leaves a long shadow on Western politics, as everyone saw how the bankers played the politicians for patsies. They privatized their gains and socialized their losses. This gross injustice has never been rectified. Rather, the contrary. 10 years of QE enabled bank CEOs and executives to enrich themselves through the merry-go-round of rising asset prices and lavish buybacks. What we have seen from the 2008 crisis to its aftermath may be the largest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich since the Norman Conquest. As someone who has worked in financial markets for the past 35 years, I have been a big beneficiary of this. And I worry deeply that financial cronyism, including the role of central banks, is in danger of discrediting true free market capitalism, which has been the engine of so much of our prosperity. The third mutant sibling is woke capitalism. Woke capitalism is the imposition of a top-down ideology onto the free market system by politically motivated bureaucrats, either from the public or the private sector. Their ideology is framed through ESG. In some cases, there is also a garnish of diversity, equity, and inclusion. To be fair, corporate governance in the public equity markets has not worked well for a long time. This is because of a genuine market failure known as the agency problem. Fund managers, acting as agents, have mostly failed to ensure proper governance on behalf of the beneficial owners of the shares, mainly because it was too burdensome or too expensive. Into this governance vacuum stepped BlackRock, the indexation industry, the United Nations, and of course, the European Union. The intent behind all three elements of ESG, environment, social, and governance, may actually be a good one. But the effect has been to create a set of standardized, ideologically based taxonomies which have very little to do with good governance. But the correct response to woke capitalism should not be to revert to the status quo ante. Instead, we should all install the kind of governance that Adam Smith would have been proud of. That means every fund manager and beneficial owner taking it seriously, using technology to vote their shares in their unique, case-specific way, and engaging directly with investee companies to drive sound governance practices. By this invisible hand, we would end up with responsible, sensible outcomes. There is one final feature of free markets that we need to talk about, and that is the problem of creative destruction. Successful new businesses disrupt legacy businesses and destroy jobs at rivals. Free trade does this at scale. We have just been through 2 decades of massive global disruption, following the opening up of the WTO to China. Advocates of free markets, like myself, need to explain how we deal with the disruption they can cause to our towns and communities. Today, this challenge is starker than ever because we have entered the age of the knowledge economy. Business leaders no longer live next to the factory they are closing. They don't even live in the same town. The decisions they take about business strategy are digital rather than analog. They don't have to live with the human consequences. The failure to deal with this is cross-party. Democrats, Republicans, Tories, Labour, République En Marche, CDU, SPD, no one has covered themselves in glory. So the business stream of this conference is about a call to better governance of free markets so that they operate in the interests of the whole of society and not just a small elite. The descent of free markets into corporatism and cronyism is well advanced. One of Donald Trump's rallying cries was "Drain the swamp," and it struck a resounding chord. But once in office, he became part of the same swamp, just another crocodile, albeit a very big one. On this issue, let's call it swampinomics, there is continuity from Obama through Trump through Biden, from Juncker through to van der Leyen. Politics needs a new Teddy Roosevelt, someone who is prepared to take on the vested interests, to rid the world, the business world, of cronyism, regulatory capture, and false virtue, and to make free enterprise, to make free enterprise once again a pillar of human flourishing. It will need people from outside politics to lead a movement of change and renewal, and it will need people of integrity inside politics to carry it through. This must be one of the core purposes of ARC. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That sets us up pretty nicely. Now we definitely know what the problem is. Next up, we are very lucky to have, sadly not with us in person, but on screen, Vivek Ramaswamy, the author of Woke Inc., one of the books that actually kicked off this conversation about what is wrong with the modern company. He's also the founder of asset manager Strive and now a presidential candidate. So do we have Vivek? We do. Hello, Vivek. Welcome.
Thank you for the warm welcome, and I appreciate the opportunity to join you all this way. I quite look forward to being there in London in person, but at this particular moment, I'm speaking to you from the back of a bus in rural northwest Iowa, as would be predictable on the journey that I'm on right now. But I am looking forward to picking up on the conversation where Paul Marshall just left off, to dive deeper into the nature of this cancer and then how we overcome it. So, part of the reason why, and Paul began to touch on this, is the failure to allow creative destruction to have seen its own course. I'll begin this story with a reminder of what one of the origins of the spread of woke capitalism really was. It's not the entire story, but it's a forgotten story. It was actually the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, which many of you may well remember. I remember it well because I got my first job in the fall of 2007 in New York City at a hedge fund. Pretty interesting time to get a first job in finance. What happened in the aftermath of the '08 crisis was we saw the beginnings of what would have been a system of creative destruction. However, the government, and I think a bureaucracy within that government, intervened to prevent that creative destruction from happening, which gave fuel, moral justification of the left to then say we're going to occupy Wall Street. You might remember that movement that said they were going to redistribute money from those wealthy corporate fat cats and give it to poor people if the whole thing were nationalized in a way that stopped creative destruction from playing out in the first place. Well, what happened then was, and this was really part of the origin story of where woke capitalism was born, Wall Street actually had a clever choice to make, to say that, you know what, we will adopt certain of the norms of that left-wing backlash. Climatism, COVIDism today, but wokeism, racial wokeism, whatever the idea is, token minorities on boards, musing about the racially disparate impact of climate change after flying on that private jet to Davos. We will do these things as financial institutions. We will implement agendas through the back door that government couldn't quite implement through the front door, such cultural agendas. But we won't do it for free. We effectively expect the Occupy Wall Street movement to go away. And it did. And it turns out that other institutions in corporate life began to do the same thing. Silicon Valley, around the same time, was facing calls for breaking up big tech that used to come from the prior left. That's not a conservative call back then, it was a left-wing call. But Silicon Valley was able to make a similar move, saying that we will censor hate speech and misinformation through the back door, as governments, at least in the United States, could not do. But we didn't do it for free. We expected that the new left looked the other way when it came to leaving Silicon Valley's monopoly power intact. So I do think that that theme that Paul artfully drew on, the theme of creative destruction, it was in some ways the bureaucratic prevention of the creative destruction process that gave the intellectual, at least appearance of coherence to allow woke capitalism to spread as much as it did. Well, that was the beginning of when the ESG cancer really began to take off. The use of market actors, the use of capital, indeed in a certain sense, capitalism itself, to accomplish through the back door what government could not itself accomplish through the front door under, in the US, the constitutional process. Now, it's worth understanding two different criticisms of what exactly is going on here. The traditional criticism, a Friedmanite criticism, which I share, is that this will lead companies to be less efficient, less prosperous over the long run if they're focused on orthogonal social agendas, in addition to their core agendas of delivering products and services for customers and making a profit doing so, maximizing shareholder value. Milton Friedman's concern, which probably many of us share, which I share as well, is that companies will be less effective in delivering prosperity to society if they're diluted in their core focus from their core mission. I think there's an even deeper concern, however, which runs in the other direction, which is that it's not only that it sucks the lifeblood out of capitalism, and I do think that this partly accounts for why American and US stock returns outpaced that of Europe for the latter part of the 20th century, is that the US had a sole vision, certainly in the post-1970 era, of maximizing shareholder value as the corporate purpose, when European companies generally had multiple purposes that were tethered to a multi-stakeholder vision of the corporation. But that wasn't the only problem, not just the economic deficit, but the reverse, that it sucks the lifeblood out of a constitutional republic where citizens do not decide any longer what the right way is to settle a difference on climate change or racial injustice. But that difference and that responsibility is delegated to a small group of corporatic autocrats in the back of corporate boardrooms. And so it is equally a threat, not just to capitalism, but also a threat to democratic self-governance to decide that it is a small group of market actors that have unique responsibility to decide again through the back door what citizens could not decide anymore through the front door in a republic. And so that brings us to the question of what to do about it. I've been asked to talk to you about good governance in the side of capital markets, and so I'll constrain my comments to that scope for today, although I'll be heading right from this speech to a grassroots audience in Iowa, which I explain the threats to a constitutional republic. Here's what we can do about it in the context of corporate boardrooms. The sole purpose of a corporation should be to maximize value for its shareholders by focusing on delivering its products and services to its customers, period. Now, the question is this the moral purpose of a corporation? Yes, it is. And this is bringing back Milton Friedman's doctrine. But to answer the question of social responsibility, to say that part of corporate social responsibility is to exercise that level of restraint itself. That level of restraint is not just about maximizing the size of the pie for shareholders, but it is also about exhibiting corporate respect for the body politic itself. Part of the belief that limited liability, the special privileges granted to corporate shareholders to say that they can't be sued, that society gives them that blanket of immunity, the return that you give back to society is to stay out of the rest of society's affairs. Which brings us to what we think of now as good governance in the corporate boardroom. The ultimate irony is actually in the ESG movement that Paul Marshall eloquently spoke about, is that the failure of governance was rooted in the premise of good governance that they claim was missing in the first place. Disentangling the E and the S from the G is a core part of calling that farce for what it is. It's like an ungrammatical amalgamation of three different letters of the alphabet that really have nothing to do with one another. But not only do they have nothing to do with one another, they're actually in tension with one another. Good governance means the corporation is true to its own purpose, its own unique purpose. Different corporations may have a different mission, but part of that is sticking to the mission of that corporation without diluting that mission with environmental or social goals that are orthogonal to its purpose. So the ultimate farce at the heart of the ESG game is really the illusion that in the name of good governance, we've actually drained the lifeblood out of what governance means by commingling orthogonal environmental and social objectives in the game. The objection you'll traditionally hear is that, and it's a tough one to overcome, is that the corporate boards will today tell you that it's the market actors that are telling them to do this. So if Paul Marshall and I are saying that corporations should focus on maximizing shareholder value as their objective, well, isn't that in tension with the fact that many shareholders themselves are actually the ones who are demanding that corporations pursue these social and orthogonal objectives? On face value, it is, but the real issue today is the so-called shareholders are not the actual owners of capital in those boardrooms. And that's the key way where we wake up to the unique challenge of 2023, which were different than that of Milton Friedman when he wrote nearly 40 years ago, when he wrote 50 years ago, his famous essay about the moral purpose of the corporation. Back then, the question was the separation of ownership and control. The idea that the people who control the corporation, the management, may not be aligned with the shareholders. But today, the real question is not the separation of control from ownership. It's the separation of ownership from ownership. When the people who proclaim to be the shareholders in those corporate boardrooms, the very people who now are not the victims but the perpetrators of environmental and social agendas permeating the boardrooms, the purported shareholders were not the actual shareholders, the actual owners of capital. And that, in a nutshell, is the essence of the BlackRock problem. Now, the way we deal with that is to make sure that the voices that are heard in those corporate boardrooms are indeed the voices of the owners of capital themselves. Where does this problem trace back to? None other than not the invisible hand of the market, but the invisible hand of government itself. And I will leave this thought with you all in closing. I've been there on the other side of this before. I know it's a bit challenging to be held captive to a man speaking to you via a screen who can't hear an audience response to take cues on when it's time to wrap up. So I'll say that I will be sympathetic to you, having been on the other side of that before, but I will say this in closing. Here's the dirty little secret. What is causing those pro-ESG market actors like BlackRock to behave the way they are is none other than actually the invisible hand of government itself. Government actors like pension funds from states in the US like California and New York, to pension funds of Western European countries or European pension funds, that themselves are trying to accomplish a political agenda by telling the BlackRocks and the Vanguards of the world that they don't get access to manage that pension fund money unless they adopt proxy voting and shareholder engagement guidelines that speak for the political objectives that those state actors couldn't achieve through the front door. That is why they're using everybody's money, including those of ordinary citizens, to tell corporate boards like Apple and Chevron and Exxon that they have to adopt these racial and climate policies. It's because the people whose money they manage, at least the largest of those actors, are really government actors that are themselves abusing those pension fund holders, which in turn leads back to a much more familiar problem. The bureaucracy of governments that fail the citizens or the pensioners who they're supposed to represent. So in many ways, this is hopefully an uplifting story that the culprit at the end of the day in this otherwise complex cancer is a familiar culprit. It's a culprit of bureaucrats represented in government that are no longer responsive to the interests of the citizens they were supposed to represent. But in the modern moment, it has taken the avatar of this new woke industrial complex where they're deputizing these private actors in the name of capitalism to carry out fundamentally anti-capitalistic objectives. And once you see that for what it is, the solutions then become that much clearer, ultimately from rescinding things like pro-ESG protective provisions, like we have in the United States and in Western Europe, all the way to disentangling public pension funds abusing these market actors to get them to adopt agendas that they couldn't through the front door. So with that said, I hope that foregrounds the panel discussion that you're about to have over there. And I will say this in closing, that from a US perspective, we live in a 1776 moment, but a 1776 moment that I hope rings true around the world, where citizens of democracies and citizens of self-governing nations have an opportunity to say hell no to these agendas. That we, the people, will once again be the ones who decide the differences on climate change policies to racial injustice. That we, the people, will restore in our constitutional republics, in our self-governing models, in our nations around the world. We, the citizens, will take back control from this merger of state power and corporate power that together is doing what neither one could do on its own. I think that we live in one of those moments today. And if I imagine what it might have been like to be alive in the spring of 1776 in the United States, that was an exciting time to be alive. I think we live in one of those moments today. Now it's up to us to take the kind of action that the founding fathers of the nation that I'm looking to lead led in the United States. A great uprising, if you will, that is a response to the Great Reset, that merger of state power and corporate power that we reject. But it's not going to be up to us to just, to borrow a biblical analogy, complain about the Pharaoh, but to ask ourselves inside, what is it that makes us want to bend the knee? And once we answer that, we have the path back to our solution. So thank you all for letting me, barge into the conference this way. It's actually my pleasure to do it. I've heard great feedback from many of you and friends who are already there participating in the conference, and you can be sure that I'll be joining you all in person at the next available opportunity. Wish you all the best and have a great panel discussion to follow. Thanks again, and we'll talk soon.
Well, I would say thank you to Vivek, but I think he's gone. But that was really, really interesting. Right, onwards. We now do have the panel discussion as discussed. So if I get my panel to come up, if you come up, and then I can introduce you, because then we'll know who's who. First, we have Derek. Why don't you consider the end, Derek? Okay. Derek Kreefeld, who is CEO of the State Financials Officer Foundation, which has taken a pretty firm stand against ESG over the years and referred to in the US press a couple of times as the tip of the spear against the ESG movement. Yeah. You can sit wherever you want, the three of you, just perfect in a row. Wonderful, thank you. Then we have Baroness Helena Morrissey, who I think a lot of you will know, the founder of the 30% Club, which is one of the very few organizations I know of which has set out to do something, named their targets very precisely, and actually achieved it in a relatively short amount of time. And finally, we have Terence Keeley, who is the CEO and CIO of 1.6, an advisory firm that he has founded to help institutional and high net worth investors optimize the impact of their investment portfolios, impact being the key word, which we're going to talk about more. He's also the author of Sustainable, Moving Beyond ESG to Impact Investing, and until last year was an advisor to BlackRock. In fact, Larry Fink has written the introduction to Terence's book, which I'm pretty impressed by, and he's obviously significantly closer to Larry Fink than I will ever be. Right, onwards. Sorry, I'm changing microphones. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Derek.
Yes.
I wonder if we could start with you. And we've heard from Vivek about how ESG is a cancer, about how it sucks the lifeblood out of the corporate world, it sucks the lifeblood out of democracy, sucks the lifeblood out of governance as a whole. Now, your organization uses a hashtag ESG scam. So that's taking it even a little further. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about what your problem is with ESG.
Well, we're calling it what it is. We do believe it is a scam. Anything that takes other people's capital and uses it to advance a political agenda that person, by the way, has no say or even knowledge sometimes of, is in fact a scam. And so I represent an organization of 35 state officials from 28 states. Together we represent $3 trillion of assets under management, many pension funds. And many of our states have just said enough is enough. The core economic engine for many of our states are some of the very things that the ESG movement is pushing against. I think the other thing that really makes it a scam is that the E and the S arguably have been a moving target, especially the S, where it's subjective. It's based on someone else's opinion of what ESG standards should be. There's no really great defined definition of the standard to which you should try to meet to achieve that ESG investing standard. So
you can't make something like that objective, right? You can't create tick boxes for it. People do.
No.
You created a tick box ESG culture where people will run through spreadsheets and tick boxes about what's going on, but you can't do that with something like
No, and our states have a lot of people don't realize, but in America, a lot of the state treasurers are the sole decision makers for banking contracts. Many of them sit on these pension boards. So last year, together, we decided to get BlackRock's attention, to get Vanguard's attention, State Street's attention. We led a divestment movement that divested $5 billion from BlackRock. This year, thanks to some of the legislation that's passed, we estimate we're probably in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 billion additional dollars this year. That has been moved away from some of these large asset managers. And we know that that's a drop in the bucket, but it's getting their attention.
Well, it did get their attention, right? And we hear significantly less from BlackRock now about ESG. So you've already had an effect.
Yes.
Yes.
And had stories written about us in the New York Times, and yeah.
So much so that Larry Fink no longer uses the phrase ESG.
Yeah.
He's stricken it from his vocabulary.
Conscientious capitalism. I think
Conscientious
is the
capitalism.
word of choice now.
Yeah. Terence, let's hear from you briefly, because I think your view is similar, but maybe not quite so strident
Well, in
on
fact,
ESG.
it differs, Marin, in that whether we call it backdoor socialism or cultural Marxism, which is what we heard from Oz Guinness this morning, I look at it from much more of a financial perspective. So, in fact, ESG has amounted to the greatest misallocation of financial assets in history relative to its intent. Just so people have these statistics, $120 trillion worth of assets are signatories to the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. And Bloomberg, your shop, not Financial Times, estimates that there's $45 trillion worth of ESG, socially responsible and sustainable investments outstanding. The very sad fact of the matter is that those assets were intended to do well and to do good. That is to say, to generate good returns while simultaneously solving the great social and environmental problems of our day, are doing neither. In actual fact, they are doing a lot more destruction than they are doing instruction, and that is because they are based on divestment rather than investment.
They're not all based on that. And we heard a lot
Correct.
during the great ESG bubble about how we could invest in ESG funds and we would make more money than if we invested in other types of funds. And perhaps that's turned out to be a function of low interest rates, apart from anything else. And their
Hardly.
losses are a function of changing interest rates.
Yeah. In actual fact, Marin, if we actually were to look at those asset classes that are doing well and doing good, very few of them are on the public equity front. But impact investors, and I always like to cite the largest impact investor in the world, Sorensen Impact Center in Salt Lake City, have a private equity portfolio that is focused strictly on serving the underserved, strictly on promoting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and has annualized returns of 54% per annum. 54% per annum. To the financial minds in the audience, I'm sure that's a stunning statistic.
Terence, can I ask you before we move any further to explain what you mean by impact investing, what the difference is between ESG and impact?
So impact investors are actually looking for some type of verifiable environmental or social goal. Perhaps it's homelessness, perhaps it's recidivism, perhaps it's promoting gender or racial equity in economic opportunities, or for example, low-income housing. So it's an investment that has a very genuine purpose, that is social or environmental, lower greenhouse gases, a very specific impact investment purpose that has to be measured tangibly.
Okay, but isn't that still using other people's money for a social purpose that they may not have consented
right,
to?
Not when it's done rightly, and where, in fact, people sign up, whether it's for concessionary or non-concessionary returns. I've written a book on it. It would be easy to just sell the book. So.
Okay. Helena, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the 30% Club and what that means to you in terms of, well, really it's about the G, isn't it, what you're doing?
It is, yeah, and I think Vivek was quite right to call out E, S, and G should be, separate. So the 30% Club, the catalyst for that was the financial crisis of 07, 08 that we've already heard about from Paul and Vivek. And the motivation behind it was to try to address the fact that we'd seen the most egregious example of the risks around groupthink. So at the time in the UK, more than 90% of board members on our top 350 listed company boards were men. They were all pretty much white. Many of them gone to the same school as each other. There was a very cozy club of people who were regarded as the right candidates for boards. So my thinking was, let's prise open the lid on that cozy club, and the obvious place to start was gender, just because women aren't a minority. And the reality is that we have achieved our goal, as you kindly said at the beginning. We went from less than 10% to now 40%, clearly exceeded my expectations, otherwise I'd have called it the 40% Club. But actually, I have to look back and I can be self-critical and say, actually, did we improve governance? And I think it's a very hard one to prove. There's no cause and effect, obvious link. But I look at some of the failures that we've seen in recent years. Obviously seen over the summer a big fiasco over Nigel Farage and being debanked, and the company NatWest explaining that was because it was at odds with their position as an inclusive organization without any sense of irony. We've seen Barclays now very much, the regulator has come down obviously on Jeff Staley and said he can never serve in the financial markets again, and he's a big fine to pay. But where was the board during all of that? I mean, this has been going on for years. He literally was appointed in 2015 as CEO of Barclays, and the board at the time had 30% women, and we'd had stories in the Daily Mail about his links with Epstein then. So I have to say, how have we actually changed the governance? Has it been more like cover for everything carrying on as before?
So it's felt like false progress. We've made a lot of progress on paper,
I think,
but we haven't seen the results from
where I'm coming from it. Obviously, I'm certainly not denigrating the impact on lots of women having more opportunity to serve, and I certainly think there's more appetite now for thinking, and I should have clarified, this is not about a quota. This is the opposite to a quota. This was saying, appoint people on merit, but let's broaden the definition of merit so that it's not just who you know, and it's, as I say, broadening the sources of people who serve on boards. So that has been a good thing, I think. But the impact was supposed to be that boards would be more honest, better at spotting things, preempting things, and we would have fewer scandals, fewer corporate failures, less corruption.
Hasn't happened.
And so far, the jury is out, for sure.
Okay, so what would you do differently now?
So it's easy with hindsight, isn't it? Well, I don't know if it is. I mean, Paul already called out, as did Vivek, that actually shareholders need to use their vote more. But I actually think that we need to look again at what it is to be, how the boards should conduct themselves. I had the good fortune of serving most of my executive career at a company, a very small company really in the scheme of things today, set up by a guy who had built a whole investment philosophy based on the idea that no one has a monopoly on great ideas. I mean, Stuart Newton would never have known what a diversity initiative was if it hit him in the face. I mean, he never used those words. But he said to me at the time when I was, this is obviously many moons ago, I was a young woman, I was a mother, which was unusual in the city at the time. I'd gone to state school, or public school, as you call it in America. I had studied philosophy at university. He said, bring all those differences to the table. He gave me a license to disagree. And I think from serving on board, sometimes, I don't think board members now, currently, feel that they have a license to disagree. And so they just go along with things, and then we're back to where we started.
Okay, Terence, I feel like you're wanting to step in there.
I'm also a philosophy major, so I just wanted to
Okay. Derek.
I think what is clear, and it should be a consensus on this panel, is that good governance is a sine qua non of excellence in capitalism. And thankfully, Helen has been leading that charge for some time.
Derek, can I ask you, clearly you don't want an ESG overlay as ESG stands on public investments and on pension investments, etc. But if not ESG, what? In that most people, if you ask them, most individual investors will say that they do want their investments to have some kind of overlay of long-term sustainability about them. So if it isn't ESG as we know it now, what is it that you think should change?
Well, most retirees and pensioners in America that we talk to simply want to be able to retire when they want to retire.
Okay, that's their version of sustainability.
And that requires fiduciary duty on part of the board of trustees that are managing it, the asset managers. It impels these boards and these elected officials to do their fiduciary duty, to manage the money to bring the best return possible. And I'm not advocating, and neither are any of our state officials, for a conservative political method to be brought into ESG to counteract. We just don't want politics in our pension funds, in our public funds. Now, I agree with Terence, if somebody wants to invest their private dollars in a way that's socially impactful, we have no bones with that. I think it is just, you're talking about millions of Americans who rely on these, and the returns may not be as good when, there's a great example, CalPERS has divested of every kind of fossil fuel over the last several years. If you've not been in fossil fuels for the last 24 months, you've missed out on huge returns.
Yeah, and you're also, as we were discussing earlier, if you've not invested in fossil fuels, you're kind of ignoring the S in ESG, because fossil fuels are, of course, one of the great drivers of people's living standards.
Right.
Yeah, so it's the whole thing, something of a red herring.
We, in really what's helped, I think, our movement grow is our effort to educate Americans on what ESG is, how we think it's being used. We started a campaign called Our Money, Our Values. That's a website, ourmoneyourvalues.com. We've had 50 million Americans that have joined the campaign, and we've seen on the retail side investors going to their financial advisors, wealth management advisors, and saying, tell me if I'm investing unknowingly in an ESG-centric fund, and if so, I want out. I want to know what alternatives are. We were really grateful to see companies like Vanguard renounce their membership with the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero this last December.
Okay, so you can return power to the individual like this?
Say that again?
You can return the power to the individual like this by having them interact, understand what's going on, interact with their financial advisors, and ask for something different. That's the way out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just wanted to pick up on something that Derek said, which was about not having boardrooms politicized. And obviously we've seen examples here where suddenly mayonnaise becomes a political issue, apparently, when I think it has a good social purpose. We just like putting it in our sandwiches or whatever. But actually what I don't want people to take from that, and I think it's a very important message from this conference, is I don't think it's right that everyone is silenced on all the principles of the day, on all the issues that really matter. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that most members of the public want CEOs, their CEO, to step up and stand up for worker rights, for reskilling of employees, to really kind of fight the corner when it comes to the wealth gap. I think what we've had is a bit of a false dawn with S and ESG in particular, and perhaps the E as well, being very much seen as kind of, a very subjective, use the words you used earlier, woke capitalism. But that's different from being a principled human being and being prepared to be courageous for things that matter and to set the context right for the businesses, all businesses in which we operate. So I just want people to not think this means business leaders should kind of go back in their box, never say a word, wait till they're spoken to before they say anything, because then we get a vacuum and we don't get that triumvirate that we seem to be calling for here at this conference of political leadership, business leadership, and civil society all working together to improve things.
Okay, is that how you see it as well, Derek?
Well, listen, I was very moved, as I think many people in the room were this morning, when Ayan Hirsi Ali spoke about seed packets. And this is an optimistic forum, and our focus is on solutions. And I just want to point out that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is a helpful way of framing the challenges ahead, could be achieved by mobilizing $3.5 trillion worth of private capital in a mindful way. The impact investment community is prepared to start doing this, and it's only 1.6% of total assets that are outstanding. So the solutions, the gravest solutions to humanity's challenges over the next decades are really within our reach. We can solve these problems. I don't care if it's recidivism, homelessness, maternal health, infant mortality rates, literacy rates. All of these problems can be resolved, Marin. We have the capital to do it. We live in the age of abundance. We have misallocated capital to ESG. We need to reallocate it to far more impactful strategies.
Okay, we've misallocated. Okay, that was a popular one. Obvious misallocation of capital with ESG.
Yeah.
So, as far as you see it, the part of one's capital that is not impact simply has no ESG overlay of any kind, goes straight back to the ideas of Milton Friedman, and is simply left to make as much money as possible and along the way automatically benefit all stakeholders.
And let me be clear, the pursuit of those profits and the pursuit of the use of the free markets is the very, very best way to generate those, including, where's Paul, through creative destructionism. We do need some creative destructionism in the world. That's how we, in fact, get rid of some of our most efficient companies. I would put Uber in the category of a creative destruction firm that has probably done more social good than evil.
Derek, you were saying earlier that you're certainly getting the attention of the big fund managers and you're getting some traction with what you're trying to do. But do you feel that we have reached a genuine turning point? I mean, the fact that we can sit here and discuss it, there are quite a few interesting books being written on this subject, and also, as mentioned earlier, that this great turning point in interest rates does change the way people perceive what we might now call old-fashioned ESG growth, etc. Do you feel like we're at a genuine turning point?
I think so, at least in the United States, I think we are. We've seen more than half of the states now introduce or pass anti-ESG legislation. We continue to see state divestments. There's lawsuits starting. There's a suit suing the city controller of New York for mismanagement of pension funds on behalf of police officers and firefighters and teachers. And I think that you're seeing more asset managers make public comments about, well, maybe ESG isn't the best investment option right now. And you're starting to see people back off from some of that. Terrence would probably be able to go into a lot more detail, but from our perspective, we feel like at least the brand ESG is damaged. And Larry Fink called it conscientious capitalism. I think it'll be interesting to see as we go in the future if it continues to be pushed but called something else at this point.
We say, with most of these political battles, it's all over except for the cussing and the fighting. ESG is officially dead. It has very few legs to stand on. Even the Financial Times is now publishing articles critical of ESG. That's another point to make. But broadly speaking, we are a hopeful assembly. We know that there are better ways. There are solutions. And those solutions are actually within our reach. That's really an important message I think we wanted to come out of this.
Yeah.
Okay, so for you, the key solution here is impact investing.
Pivot to impact. Not all assets, most assets should be invested for profits only, but a small 1.6% of global assets funds the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I can get behind that.
Okay. Helena, for you, what's the way forward? What's the solution?
So I think it's actually healthy that the whole ESG movement is now sort of being, pulled apart and thought carefully, because clearly a lot of these concepts are very complex, very nuanced, and perhaps everyone charged headlong. I do think the combination of asset owners having more of a say, I think boards actually taking governance seriously, and I think there's been a lot of tick boxing, and that's where investors come back in and say, so what are you really doing? And I'd love to see even the people that they pick for the boards. I mean, it varies country to country, but in this country, certainly, there are a lot of people, you need experience and then you need the ability to speak up when something's wrong. And I said, there's not a license to disagree at present, but we're also tending to choose people who've kind of had a quiet life. I went to a party a little while ago with people who were being singled out for having made a big impact on the City of London over the past quarter of a century. And frankly, we all agreed that none of us would get hired now because we all are too bolshy, to use a word that I think Paul uses about me. But we don't put our head down. We kind of have character. We speak up when we see something that's wrong. And we have to set that as the standard. And companies have kind of ended up hiding behind all these different layers of, this is what governance looks like. It's not about having hundreds of pages in a board deck. It's about people who really believe in something, as this conference is focused on.
Are you saying responsible citizenship?
I'm saying responsible citizenship. That's the answer.
But listen, how do you make the fund management community become responsible citizens like this? And one of the reasons why ESG has become so huge was because it has been a massive marketing opportunity for the fund management industry, one in which they can sell as being, or they have been able to sell as, do good, make money at the same time, and charge a higher fee on. And this has been, to my mind, pretty irresponsible. And how do you stop that business behaving like this?
So this is where everybody in this room can have an impact, because everybody in this room has a pension or is likely to have some savings that are invested. And you can demand more. You can ask your questions of your fund manager. At the moment, as we've said and as our preceding speakers said, that money is it's your money that's being used at present, and a lot of people just have no idea that they can object to that, they can write in, they can ask for more. And if everybody does that, the alliance part is where that becomes powerful. So I think transferring this back to the end user, the beneficiary, the person whose money it is absolutely key here.
Yeah, and that feels like it's beginning to be underway, doesn't it?
Hold your fund manager to account. Just don't say, oh, well, I'll pay you all these fees and I'll accept what performance I'm given and you can vote on my behalf. I mean, no, enough's enough. I
always say, write to your fund manager. Write to your, send him a letter. That always
Everyone's going to hate me in the industry.
Proper letter. And for you, it's about people interacting again with their IFA, with their fund manager, and telling them directly. But of course, a huge part of the population are never going to do that. There's always going to be an awful lot of investors.
In America, they are going to the financial advisors, and they're asking some very, very wise questions about the types of funds they're getting invested in. We're seeing the impact. Some of these ESG funds are closing. They're no longer spending money to market them because they know that people are pulling out of them. So for me, fiduciary duty rules, capitalism works. Paul Marshall made the comment about capitalism solving some of the world's issues. The Heritage Foundation in the United States has a great study that shows the top 50 cleanest nations in the world also happen to be the 50th free market nations in the world. So you can't argue with some of that information and data that capitalism can solve some of the biggest issues that we're dealing with in our society.
But we still have a reputation problem, don't we? And that people, the ordinary person, still thinks of the big company as being a force for evil rather than a force for good. So we have a branding problem. Terence, can you see any way to fix that branding problem?
You know what I would say, Marin, and we heard again eloquently this morning that freedom is merely the opportunity to do what we ought to do. And I would say that it's very clear to me that mindfulness, whether or not it's in the way we allocate our assets, how we choose an asset manager, how we govern, is going to determine really the future arc. I know the arc of history bends towards justice, but we can bend it even more with greater mindfulness. We're going to get the world we deserve either in this life or the next. And my belief is that we should be focusing on this world.
All right. Let me ask you all just before we finish, because we're out of time, in one word, two words possibly. What makes a good company? Is it the E, the S, or the G?
that our entire choice?
It's the G. It's the G is the
G,
answer.
yeah, G.
Only that with the G.
There's no good corporation without great G.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much to my panel, and we will now hand back for the next session.